Nice Micro Monday, growing up in the 90s, early 2000s. Hello friends, I recently watched a video from McCullough, Canadian YouTuber and a big expert on the millennial culture, I guess, about how defining the 90s was for him, and he also brought up a book that discusses that kind of period of time of the 90s is going to be a very culturally defining and a big generational shift for our generation and the generations that follow us, because the people who remember the times before the widespread use of smartphones and cell phones in general will have a very different kind of attitude than the people who already grew up with smartphones and mobile phones in general being kind of more ubiquitous. And when he told his story, which is a very interesting story actually, so you should definitely watch his video after you watch this one. But when he told his story, I really kind of had this feeling that even though JJ is older than me by a few years, I still kind of feel like that I grew up in a little more ancient times than he did, just by the virtue of him being a son of a Canadian middle-class family, while I was a son of a Hungarian middle-class family, and our situation in Eastern Europe was a bit different than in Canada. And it just really got me thinking that back that time, those differences were probably even bigger than they are today, just by virtue of what were the big technical innovations of that time. And so I would define like my upbringing is kind of the 90s. I was kind of young in the early 90s, but the second half of the 90s and the first half of the 00's, so like until like 2005, 6, 7, that was kind of that period that I wanted to discuss a little, because that was kind of like 2007, 8, that was kind of the end of the era without smartphones. I personally didn't get a smartphone until much later, but that is just personal preference. What happened is that JJ, for example, brought up the story that in his last year of high school was the first time when it was accepted for someone to hand in a homework or a school assignment that was typed in a computer and printed out, which was not a thing in my school, even though, as I just said, I went to high school later than he did. And one of these interesting things were the computer rooms that JJ talks about it. And so I lived in a dormitory while I was in high school, and in our dormitory, it was explicitly forbidden for the students to have their own computers in their rooms at that time. And we had the computer room which could accommodate like, I don't know, 15 or 12 people at the same time in a dormitory which had like, I don't know how many hundred students in that building. And of course, I was in a class with most of my roommates. We had like the high-level computer classes at school. So we had to hand in programming assignments, which of course you had to hand in on the 3.5-inch floppy disks. So I'm not that old that I had to use the bigger ones. But still, we had to go to that dormitory computer room that was only open for 3 hours every day. We had to plead with the teachers that we have homework, so they would give us priority to stay there. We had to use this time window to finish our programming homeworks or, I don't know, Microsoft Office homeworks there, which was the only thing that we need to do on computers for school was the thing that we got from the homework from computer class. And so that was kind of the big difference for me. And one of the things that is also very different from JJ's experience is video games. So my family, we did not have video game consoles, and I don't really know anyone who had any video game consoles when we were kids. Only thing I know about is that one of my cousins, they had a video game console, but that was like the cheapest Chinese knockoff you could get from the market. And we played with that a little. My father would categorically refuse to ever buy anything like that for us though. So we didn't have one. We had a computer quite early, I would say, compared to my peers, except for a few who had more technical parents, of course, because my uncle had an old Commodore computer that somewhere in the second half of the 90's, maybe it was almost like 2000, when he decided to just buy like a regular PC, or a PC that we would consider regular by today's standard, and he just gave me that Commodore. He had a lot of games for it, which were, well, the game distribution, that was another interesting thing. But anyways, that computer ended up the reason why I really started learning programming, for example. So he gave me that computer because when I was at his place, I was little, he would show me the games on it and it was fun. And then he would give me that computer after he stopped using it. And after a few years, the cassettes, so it was like a magnetic cassette tapes we had the games on, and those stopped working after a time. I guess something went wrong. So there was nothing I could do with the computer, so I decided to learn how to write my own programs on it, which was my gateway drug, I guess, into this world of programming. And I remember that my grandmother would be very angry at my uncle for buying a new computer because that was really expensive, even though he bought it explicitly for his work. So he had his own kind of entrepreneurship. So he had like this one person company who would do designs on the computer, and that's why he bought it. So he bought it to make money, and still my grandmother didn't really appreciate that would be a useful thing for him. And so basically what I wanted to get to with this kind of comparison of my childhood relating to technology and JJ's childhood as relating to technology, that it was really the innovation during those times, like in the 90's and early 2000s, was really in a lot of this innovation was in the hardware. So of course, in a more like a lower income part of the world, like Eastern Europe, you could generally only buy things as like a middle income household. You could only buy things that were kind of obsolete already on the markets. So I remember my first PC, like a regular, PC by today's standards, like the IBM compatible PC, as they were called back then, was a second-hand computer. And that was like, I don't know how many years behind the top models. And that really did amount to something, that difference, because you just could not play the new games on it. And similarly, the internet, for you to be able to afford good internet, that came to our country much later than to a lot of Western countries, I guess. And even though our little hometowns, I am from a very small place, and that town had a very visionary type of guys there who built up the first cable TV based internet service in our town. It was quite earlier than in many other places in the country, so we could ditch the kind of internet which you had to dial in through the phone line. So because we only had, people only had one phone at the home, and that phone you either use for calling, and if you connected to the internet through that, no one could reach you on the phone. So that would limit how much and when you can actually use your internet connection. And our little town was very quick on adapting this cable TV. So the cable TV guys realized that they could provide internet through the cable TV solutions, and that was much faster. Of course, our first internet package for that had, I think, 300 megabytes limitation, and it was not like after 300 megabytes the speed goes down. The speed didn't go down, but for every megabyte they would surcharge you at the end of the month. So we had to be very careful for that. But they had totally inside the town, so whoever subscribed to this service, we could use unlimited bandwidth between the computers. So you could just play games on the network, on the local, the town's network. You could play games just like if you were playing on like a local network, which was fun. And of course, the file sharing worked between those computers just like it would work between, different computers in a company or something. The people figured out what kind of software you need to kind of have this file sharing network set up. And I remember that there was like a chat room for the users on this local area network, and there was like some FPS gaming club there who would practice, and they would participate in some tournaments sometimes, and when there would be the tournament, they would ask the file sharing guys to stop the file sharing service for the period of the tournament, so their bandwidth and their latency could be as good as possible. So that was kind of a very interesting period, and but you had to be able to afford that, and I am pretty sure that we could afford those things a bit later than the people in North America. And the same with phones, of course, because the kind of the middle class family could afford phones much later, like mobile phones and smartphones much later on their income compared to their American counterparts. And I think this is kind of changed a little nowadays, because nowadays it's not really the limiting factor and the innovation is not really that much in hardware anymore. And when it is, it's mostly on the server side. So generally, to kind of participate in these big cultural things, because for that previously it was a limiting factor whether you have a computer or not, whether you have internet or not. Nowadays, because kind of computers are affordable, like even if you cannot afford, the newest iPhone, you can probably afford a cheap Chinese smartphone, which you can use the same kind of cultural outlets like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever goes on today. And you are not that much limited by the money you can spend on hardware. And of course, this, I'm not really sure that, however, our culture capitalizes on the companies who are exploiting this situation, how they use their power. I am not 100% in agreement with their ways, but still it's kind of we are more pushed together in kind of like this global society. So probably the kids who grow up today and will listen to, maybe they grew up in like, I don't know, Eastern Europe today, and they will listen to someone's experience from North America who grew up at the same time with them. Maybe their only difference will be, okay, I remember Facebook, I remember Twitter, but on my phone it was a little slower than on the phone of the American kid, and not like, well, I am younger than that guy, but I still feel like I grew up in like 5 years later or 5 years earlier than he did. Okay, so this was a kind of a little unregular or irregular Nice Micro Monday topic. It was just kind of tangential to technology, but if you want to see more content like this, you can always give me a thumbs up, and you can tell me your opinion down there, what you think about this kind of more rambling type of content. Do you want to hear more about this kind of less specifically technical issues that I have an opinion on, but more like cultural relation or my personal experience with technology from, the far, far past of the 90s and early 2000s? Leave me in the comment what you are interested in, and I might make a video on that topic. And of course, subscribe, like, whatever you have to do to see the next video when it comes up, and I will see you then. Bye bye.